The sound of gunfire echoing through Deadwood's main street barely caused Beatrice Jensen to flinch as she knelt in the dirt behind her boarding house, carefully collecting every single scrap of vegetable peel that had fallen from her knife. She was 22 years old in the summer of 1877, and she had learned long ago that survival in the Dakota Territory meant treating even potato skins like gold. The miners who flooded into Deadwood after the discovery of gold in the Black Hills the previous year threw away more food in a day than her family had eaten in a week back in Wisconsin, and it made her stomach turn with a mixture of disgust and opportunity. She gathered the peels into her apron, already planning how she would boil them down for broth, dry the strips for winter feed for the 3 chickens she kept in a coop made from discarded lumber, and use the remaining pulp to fertilize the struggling vegetable garden she maintained in the rocky soil. Nothing went to waste in Beatrice's world. Not a thread, not a nail, not a drop of water. Her mother had died when she was 14, and her father had drunk himself into an early grave 2 years later, leaving Beatrice and her younger brother Thomas to fend for themselves. Thomas had died of cholera during their journey west, and Beatrice had arrived in Deadwood with nothing but the clothes on her back, a cast-iron skillet, and an ironclad determination never to be hungry again. She stood up, brushing the Dakota dust from her worn calico dress, and turned to head back into the kitchen when she noticed a man watching her from the alley between her boarding house and the assayer's office next door. He was tall, lean in the way cowboys got from spending more time in the saddle than at a table, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He wore the typical garb of a ranch hand, his hat pulled low, his boots scuffed and dusty from the trail. What caught her attention was not his appearance, but the expression on his face as he watched her gather scraps from the dirt. It was not mockery, as she might have expected, but something closer to confusion mixed with curiosity. "Can I help you with something?" Beatrice asked, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone she had perfected dealing with rowdy miners and traveling gamblers who thought a woman running a boarding house alone was an invitation for impropriety. The cowboy pushed off from the wall where he had been leaning and approached with an easy, unhurried gait. "Name is Dalton Nash. I just rode in from the Rocking H Ranch about 30 miles south. Boss sent me to town for supplies and told me the Jensen boarding house was the cleanest and most affordable place to stay. Reckon you would be Miss Jensen?" "I would," Beatrice said, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to assess character quickly. She saw no meanness in his face, no cruelty around his mouth. His clothes were mended but clean, his hands calloused from honest work. "Room is $4 a week, includes breakfast and supper. You pay in advance, no drinking in the rooms, no guests after 9 o'clock, and you keep your boots off my clean floors. Those are the rules. Can you abide by them?" Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, counting out 4 silver dollars into her palm. His fingers were warm when they brushed against her hand, and Beatrice felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that she immediately dismissed as indigestion from the biscuits she had eaten too quickly that morning. "I can abide by any rules you set, Miss Jensen," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up sharply. He was smiling, but it was a gentle smile, not the leering grin she had grown accustomed to from men in this rough town. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious why you were picking up those scraps just now. Are they for animal feed?" Beatrice felt her spine stiffen defensively. "That and other things. I do not believe in waste, Mr. Nash. Every single thing that comes into my possession has multiple uses, and I make sure I extract every bit of value before I consider it truly spent. If that seems strange to you, perhaps you would be more comfortable at the Grand Central Hotel down the street. They throw away enough food every night to feed a family for a month." Instead of taking offense, Dalton's expression grew more interested. "No offense meant, Miss Jensen. Truth is, I find it admirable. Most folks I know would not take the time. They would just kick those peels aside and let them rot." "Then most folks you know are fools," Beatrice said bluntly, then immediately regretted her harsh tone. She was not usually so prickly, but something about this cowboy made her feel oddly exposed, as if he could see past the careful defenses she had built around herself. I apologize. That was rude. Let me show you to your room. She led him through the back door into the kitchen, which was spotlessly clean despite being equipped with nothing but the most basic supplies. Every pot hung in its designated place, every utensil was scrubbed and organized by size. The wood stove was black with fresh polish, and the floor, though made of rough planks, was swept so clean it looked like it belonged in a much finer establishment. Beatrice saw Dalton's gaze sweep over the room, taking in the details, and she felt an unexpected surge of pride. The boarding house had 6 rooms for rent on the second floor, and Beatrice led Dalton to the one at the end of the hall. It was small but immaculate, with a narrow bed covered in a quilt she had sewn herself from fabric scraps traded from the dressmaker in exchange for meals. A small table held a wash basin and pitcher, both made of simple tin but polished until they gleamed. A single chair sat by the window, which looked out over the main street of Deadwood. "Supper is at 6 o'clock sharp," Beatrice said, setting a folded towel on the bed. "I serve what I cook, and I expect you to eat it all. I will not tolerate waste at my table." "Understood," Dalton said, setting his saddlebags down on the chair. "Miss Jensen, if you do not mind my asking, how long have you been running this place on your own?" 2 years, Beatrice said, moving toward the door. "I saved every penny I earned working at the laundry until I had enough to lease this building. Fixed it up myself, mostly with materials I salvaged from abandoned claims and buildings. Built half the furniture from crates and barrels people left behind when they moved on." Dalton looked at the sturdy chair with new appreciation. "You built this?" "I did. The frame was a shipping crate for mining equipment, and the seat is woven from rope I unraveled from an old harness. Took me 3 days to get the weave tight enough to be comfortable." She paused at the door, then added, "I will expect you downstairs at 6 o'clock, Mr. Nash. Do not be late." She left before he could respond, her heart beating faster than it should have been. There was something about Dalton Nash that unsettled her, though she could not quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was simply that he had looked at her directly when he spoke, meeting her eyes instead of letting his gaze wander to her figure the way so many men did. Or perhaps it was the genuine interest he had shown in her scrap collection, as if he actually understood why it mattered instead of thinking her mad or miserly. The afternoon passed quickly as Beatrice prepared supper for her boarders. She had 5 rooms occupied, including Dalton's, and she prided herself on providing meals that were both nutritious and satisfying despite her limited budget. Today's menu would be beef stew made from the toughest, cheapest cuts of meat, slow cooked until tender, with vegetables she had gotten for a fraction of the usual price because they were slightly bruised or misshapen. She wasted nothing. The beef bones would be boiled for stock, the vegetable scraps would go to the chickens, and the fat skimmed from the top of the stew would be saved for making soap. As she worked, she found her thoughts drifting back to the cowboy in room 6, Dalton Nash. Even his name had a certain ring to it, solid and dependable. She wondered what kind of man he was, what had brought him to Deadwood, whether he was the type to drink away his wages on payday or save them for something more substantial. Not that it mattered to her, of course. He was just another boarder, another source of the steady income that kept her business afloat and food on her table. At precisely 6 o'clock, Beatrice rang the small bell she kept by the kitchen door to summon her boarders to supper. They came down one by one. Mr. Patterson, an aging miner who had been with her for nearly a year. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Chinese immigrants who worked at the laundry and spoke very little English. Young Samuel Cooper, barely 18 and working as a clerk at the general store. And finally Dalton, who appeared at the top of the stairs with his hair damp from washing and his shirt changed to a clean one. The dining room was another testament to Beatrice's resourcefulness. The long table had been constructed from planks salvaged from an old freight wagon, sanded smooth and finished with linseed oil she had rendered herself from flax seeds. The chairs were a mismatched collection she had acquired one at a time, repairing broken legs and recaning seats until each one was sturdy and serviceable. In the center of the table sat a simple vase made from a glass bottle, filled with wildflowers she had gathered that morning from the hills outside town. Beatrice served the stew with thick slices of bread she had baked that morning, the flour stretched further by the addition of ground oats and a bit of potato flour she made from the small damaged potatoes the grocer could not sell. She watched as her boarders dug in with enthusiasm, especially Dalton, who ate with the focused appreciation of a man who spent most of his meals on the trail eating beans and hardtack. "This is mighty fine cooking, Miss Jensen," Dalton said after his second helping. "Best meal I have had in months." "Thank you," Beatrice said, feeling an unwelcome warmth rise in her cheeks. "Would you like more bread? I made extra." "If you have it to spare," Dalton said, then paused, "though I suppose you would not have made extra if you could not spare it." Beatrice found herself almost smiling as she passed him the bread basket. "You learn quickly, Mr. Nash." After supper, while the other boarders retired to their rooms or went out for the evening, Dalton lingered in the dining room as Beatrice cleared the table. She was about to tell him that guests were not permitted in the kitchen when he spoke. "Miss Jensen, would you mind if I helped you with the dishes? Where I come from, it was considered proper manners to help the cook clean up after a meal." Beatrice paused with a stack of plates in her hands, surprised. "That is not necessary, Mr. Nash. It is part of the service you pay for." "I know it is not necessary," Dalton said, standing up, "but I would like to help anyway, if you will let me." There was something earnest in his expression that made it impossible to refuse. Beatrice nodded toward the kitchen. "Very well, you can dry while I wash. The towels are in the drawer by the stove." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, Beatrice scrubbing each dish clean in water she had heated on the stove, Dalton drying them carefully and stacking them on the counter. She noticed that he took the same care with the simple tin plates that most people would reserve for fine china, and something about that attention to detail made her chest tighten. "You said you built most of the furniture yourself," Dalton said eventually. "Where did you learn carpentry?" "My father was a furniture maker back in Wisconsin," Beatrice said, her hands stilling in the dishwater for a moment. "Before he started drinking, he taught me how to use tools properly, said every person should know how to fix what breaks and build what they need." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was, before the drink took him," Beatrice said quietly. "After my mother died, he could not seem to find his way back to himself. By the time he passed, there was nothing left of the man who taught me to measure twice and cut once." Dalton was silent for a moment, and when Beatrice glanced at him, she saw understanding in his eyes. "I lost my own folks when I was 16, he said. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. I know something about being alone in the world." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said, and meant it. "How did you manage?" "Hired on at a ranch as a hand," Dalton said. "Foreman took pity on me, I suppose. Taught me everything about cattle and horses and living on the range. I've been working ranches ever since, moving around wherever the work takes me." He dried another plate, then added, "But I have been thinking lately that it might be time to put down roots somewhere. Save up enough to buy a small spread of my own." "That takes considerable money," Beatrice observed. "Ranch land is not cheap, even out here." "No, it is not," Dalton agreed, "which is why I need to be smarter about how I spend what I earn. I have a habit of being too free with my wages when I hit town. Buy drinks for everyone at the saloon, play cards, purchase things I do not really need. Always figure there will be more money next month, but it never seems to add up to anything substantial." Beatrice handed him the last plate, then pulled the plug on the sink and watched the dirty water drain into the bucket beneath. That water would go to the garden tomorrow, carrying with it the small bits of food waste that would nourish her struggling vegetables. "The problem with that thinking," she said, "is that money is like time. You can waste it without even noticing, and then one day you look up and wonder where it all went." "I suppose you would know," Dalton said, but there was no resentment in his voice, only curiosity. "You seem to have figured out how to make every penny count." "I had to," Beatrice said simply. "When you have been hungry enough times, you learn to value what you have." She carried the bucket of dishwater outside, and Dalton followed her into the small backyard where her garden struggled gamely against the harsh Dakota climate. She poured the water carefully along the rows of vegetables, making sure each plant received its share. In the fading light of evening, the garden looked pitiful compared to the lush plots she remembered from her childhood in Wisconsin. But to Beatrice, it represented hope, security, and the determination to thrive even in difficult circumstances. "You grow your own vegetables," Dalton observed, crouching down to examine the plants more closely. "That must save you considerable money on groceries." "Some," Beatrice acknowledged, "though the soil here is poor and the growing season is short. I amend it with compost I make from kitchen scraps and manure I trade for with the livery stable. Every bit helps." Dalton stood up, brushing dirt from his hands. "My boss at the Rocking H is always complaining that we waste too much at the ranch. Food goes bad before we can eat it. Equipment breaks because nobody maintains it properly. Supplies get lost or stolen. He says it is the way of things with ranch hands, but I am starting to think maybe it does not have to be." "It does not," Beatrice said firmly. "Waste is a choice, whether people realize it or not. You can choose to pay attention, to care for what you have, to find value in things other people overlook. Or you can choose to be careless and then wonder why you never have enough." They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Beatrice was acutely aware of Dalton's presence beside her. He was taller than she had first realized, and standing this close, she could smell the clean scent of soap and something else, something masculine and appealing that made her pulse quicken. She stepped back quickly, disturbed by her own reaction. "I should go in," she said abruptly. "I have preparations to make for tomorrow's breakfast." "Of course," Dalton said, but he did not move immediately. "Miss Jensen, would it be all right if I asked you questions sometimes? About how you do things, I mean? How you save and plan and make things last? I think I could learn a lot from your example." Beatrice looked at him sharply, searching for mockery or hidden motive, but found only honest interest. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said slowly, "though I do not claim to have all the answers. I simply do what needs to be done." "Sometimes that is the best answer there is," Dalton said, and smiled at her in the darkness. Beatrice lay awake that night in her small room on the first floor, listening to the sounds of Deadwood settling down for the night. Gunshots still echoed occasionally from the saloons, and the tinny piano music drifted through her window on the warm summer breeze. She thought about Dalton Nash upstairs in room 6 and wondered why his presence seemed to take up so much space in her thoughts. She had housed dozens of men over the past 2 years, and none of them had affected her this way. None of them had looked at her garden with genuine interest or offered to help with dishes or asked her to teach them about thrift. The next morning, Beatrice rose at dawn as always and began preparing breakfast. She made oatmeal stretched with extra water and sweetened with a bit of molasses, fried eggs from her chickens, and biscuits made from the leftover bread dough she had saved from yesterday. As she worked, she heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to find Dalton entering the kitchen, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Good morning, Miss Jensen," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wondered if you might need help with anything. I am used to being up before dawn on the ranch." Beatrice hesitated, then gestured toward the wood box by the stove. "The firewood needs splitting. There is an axe in the shed out back, and the logs are stacked behind it. If you are truly offering to help, that would be useful." Dalton grinned and headed for the back door. "Consider it done." Beatrice watched through the kitchen window as Dalton set to work, and found herself admiring the economical efficiency of his movements. He did not swing the axe wildly or waste energy on unnecessary flourishes. Instead, he studied each log, found its natural grain, and split it with precise, powerful strikes. Within half an hour, he had processed enough wood to last her several days and had stacked it neatly by the back door, arranging the pieces so they would dry properly and be easy to access. When he came back inside, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool morning air, and Beatrice found herself staring at the way the fabric clung to his shoulders before she caught herself and turned quickly back to the stove. "That should hold you for a while," Dalton said, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "You were running low. Do you have a regular supplier?" "I collect deadfall from the hills when I have time," Beatrice said, focusing intently on her biscuits. "Or trade meals for firewood with some of the miners who have access to timber." "That must take considerable time," Dalton observed. "Time I have," Beatrice said it. "Money I do not. The choice is simple." Over breakfast, Beatrice noticed that Dalton ate everything on his plate but did not take more than his fair share even when she offered seconds. She also noticed that he complimented Mrs. Chen's embroidered handkerchief and asked young Samuel about his work at the general store, drawing out the shy young man with genuine questions. There was a kindness to Dalton Nash that seemed at odds with the rough world of cowboys and cattle drives, and Beatrice found herself warming to him despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. After the other boarders had left for their various employments, Dalton remained at the table while Beatrice cleared the dishes. "I need to head to the general store for supplies," he said. "My boss gave me a list as long as my arm. Would you mind if I asked your advice on getting the best prices?" Beatrice paused, surprised. "Why would you need my advice? Surely you have purchased supplies before?" "I have," Dalton admitted, "but I've never been particularly good at negotiating or knowing which items are actually worth the money. I tend to just buy what is asked and pay what is charged. Watching you work, though, I'm beginning to realize that is probably not the smartest approach." Against her better judgment, Beatrice found herself agreeing. "Very well. Let me finish here, and I will accompany you. I need to speak with the grocer anyway about this week's order." They walked together down Deadwood's main street, which was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Miners streamed toward their claims in the hills. Freight wagons rumbled past loaded with supplies, and the boardwalks were crowded with people conducting business. Beatrice nodded to the people she knew, conscious of the curious looks directed at her and Dalton as they walked side by side. At the general store, Beatrice demonstrated her approach to shopping, which involved careful inspection of every item, comparison of prices and quality, and calm but firm negotiation with the proprietor, a portly man named Mr. Hendricks, who had been trying unsuccessfully to overcharge her since the day she arrived in Deadwood. "These potatoes are sprouting," Beatrice said, examining a sack critically. "I will give you half the asking price, and you will throw in that bag of split beans that no one else will buy." "Now, Miss Jensen, that is hardly fair," Mr. Hendricks protested. "Those are perfectly good potatoes." "They are old potatoes that will be rotten within a week if you do not sell them now," Beatrice countered. "I am offering you a chance to clear your stock at a reasonable price rather than taking a total loss. The choice is yours." Mr. Hendricks grumbled but eventually agreed, and Beatrice moved on to the next item on her list. Dalton watched the entire exchange with fascination, occasionally asking quiet questions about why she rejected certain items or accepted others. By the time they finished, Beatrice had spent half what Dalton estimated the supplies should have cost, and had acquired several additional items thrown in as part of her negotiations. When it was Dalton's turn to make his purchases, he attempted to apply what he had observed, examining the goods more carefully and questioning prices rather than accepting them at face value. To Beatrice's approval, he managed to save his employer nearly $20 on the total bill, though Mr. Hendricks looked considerably less pleased with the day's business than usual. "That was remarkable," Dalton said as they left the store, Beatrice carrying her small bundle while Dalton managed the much larger load of ranch supplies. "I never realized how much money I have been wasting all these years simply by not paying attention." "Most people do not realize," Beatrice said. "They think that because they have money in their pocket, it does not matter how they spend it. But money is a tool, just like a hammer or a plow. Used wisely, it can build something lasting. Used carelessly, it disappears without accomplishing anything." They arranged for the ranch supplies to be held at the store until Dalton could bring a wagon to collect them, then walked back toward the boarding house together. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the day was growing warm. Beatrice was aware of the weight of her shopping basket, but also of the comfortable silence that had developed between her and Dalton. It was strange to feel so at ease with someone she had known for less than 24 hours. "How long will you be staying in Deadwood?" Beatrice asked, then immediately wondered why she had asked. It should not matter to her how long he stayed. "Depends on how long it takes to conduct the ranch business," worried Dalton said. "Could be a few days, could be a couple of weeks. My boss wants me to look into purchasing some new breeding stock, and that takes time to do properly." He glanced at her. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Beatrice said, feeling her cheeks warm. "I like to know how long my rooms will be occupied, for planning purposes." "Of course," Dalton said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he did not entirely believe her explanation. Over the following days, a pattern developed. Dalton would rise early and help Beatrice with morning chores before heading out to conduct his ranch business. He split wood, carried water, repaired a broken hinge on the chicken coop, and proved himself generally useful in a dozen different ways. In the evenings after supper, they would sit together in the kitchen while Beatrice worked on her mending or her accounts, and Dalton would ask questions about her methods and philosophy. "Why do you save the fat from cooking?" he asked one evening, watching as she carefully scraped every bit of grease from a pan into a jar. "Soap," Beatrice replied. "Mix it with lye and water, and you have soap for washing. I can make a year's supply from what most people throw away." "And those scraps of fabric?" He pointed to a basket overflowing with small pieces of cloth in various colors and patterns. "Quilts, pot holders, patches for clothing, stuffing for pillows," Beatrice listed. "Every scrap has a use if you are creative enough to find it." "You see the world differently than most people," Dalton observed. "Where others see trash, you see possibility." "My mother used to say that waste was just another word for lack of imagination," Beatrice said softly. "She could make something from nothing, create beauty and utility from the most unlikely materials. I watched her patch my father's work clothes so many times that eventually there was more patch than original fabric, but they still kept him warm and decent. She never complained about having little, she just made the most of what we had." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Dalton said. "You must miss her." "Every day," Beatrice admitted, then shook herself and straightened her shoulders. "But sitting around missing people does not put food on the table or keep a roof overhead. Work is what matters. Work and planning and making sure you never let anything go to waste." Dalton was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. "Is that why you never let yourself rest? Because you are afraid that if you stop working even for a moment, everything will fall apart?" The question cut too close to the bone, and Beatrice stood abruptly, gathering her sewing supplies. "It is getting late. I should retire." "I am sorry," Dalton said quickly, standing as well. "I did not mean to overstep." Beatrice paused at the door, then turned back. "You did not overstep. You simply saw something I prefer not to examine too closely." She met his eyes. "Good night, Mr. Nash." "Good night, Miss Jensen," he replied, and something in the way he said her name made her pulse race as she climbed the stairs to her room. The next day was Sunday, and Beatrice attended services at the small church on the edge of town. She was surprised to see Dalton there, sitting in one of the back pews with his hat in his hands. After the service, he caught up with her on the walk back. "I did not figure you for a church-going man," Beatrice said. "My mother was devout," Dalton replied. "She made sure I knew my scripture and kept the Sabbath. I admit I've not been as faithful about attendance as I should be, especially when I'm out on the range, but it seems important to make the effort when I'm in town." They walked in silence for a while, the Sunday quiet of Deadwood a stark contrast to the usual chaos of weekdays. Most of the saloons were closed, and the streets were largely empty except for a few other churchgoers making their way home. "Would you like to take a walk?" Dalton asked suddenly. "It is such a fine day, and I thought perhaps you might enjoy seeing something other than the inside of your boarding house for a change." Beatrice hesitated. She had 100 tasks waiting for her back at the house, preparations for the week ahead that could not be neglected. But the sun was warm, the sky was a brilliant blue, and Dalton was looking at her with such hopeful expectation that she found herself nodding. "A short walk," she said. "I have work to do this afternoon." They headed out of town toward the hills, following a narrow path that wound between pine trees and rocky outcroppings. The air smelled of sap and wildflowers, and the sounds of Deadwood faded behind them until there was nothing but birdsong and the whisper of wind through the trees. Beatrice felt something inside her chest loosen, a tension she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. "Tell me about the ranch where you work," she said as they climbed higher. "What is it like?" Dalton's face lit up as he described the rocking H, painting a picture of rolling grasslands dotted with cattle, the constant work of maintaining fences and buildings, the camaraderie of the bunkhouse, and the satisfaction of a hard day's work done well. But he also talked about the waste he saw, the carelessness that bothered him more and more as he spent time with Beatrice. "We threw away half a side of beef last week because someone left it sitting out and it's spoiled," he said, shaking his head. And we are constantly losing tools because nobody bothers to put them back where they belong. The foreman just orders new ones and writes it off as the cost of doing business. But it seems wrong somehow. It is wrong, Beatrice agreed. That beef could have fed a family for a month if it had been properly cared for. Those tools represent hours of someone's labor to create them. Treating them carelessly is disrespectful to the work that went into making them. Dalton stopped walking and turned to face her. You really do see everything differently. I thought I understood thrift, but what you practice goes deeper than just saving money. It is about respecting the value of things, honoring the effort that went into creating them. Everything comes from somewhere, Beatrice said. Someone's labor, someone's time, someone's resources. When you waste something, you are wasting all of that. You are saying that the work and effort that went into creating it does not matter. She looked out over the valley spread below them. Deadwood nestled in the crease of the hills like a collection of children's blocks. My mother taught me that. She said every object tells a story of the people who made it and the purposes it serves. To waste something is to dishonor that story. Dalton moved closer, and Beatrice was suddenly very aware of how alone they were on this hillside, how far from town they had wandered. But she did not feel afraid or uncomfortable. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in years, a sense of safety, of being truly seen and understood. I admire you, Beatrice, Dalton said quietly, using her first name for the first time. Not just for your thrift or your cleverness, but for your strength. You have built a life for yourself from nothing, and you have done it with grace and determination. That is remarkable. Beatrice felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I simply do what needs to be done. No, Dalton said firmly, you do much more than that. You create value where others see none. You build where others would give up. You survive where others would fail. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to, and gently took her hand. And you have taught me more in a few days than I have learned in years of drifting from job to job without purpose or direction. Beatrice looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from rope and reins, hers smaller but equally work-worn. What are you saying, Dalton? I am saying that I would like to stay in Deadwood longer, he said. I would like to continue learning from you if you're willing to teach me. And I would like to know you better, not just as my landlady, but as a person. As a woman, I find myself thinking about far more than I should. Beatrice's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. She had not allowed herself to think of romance or courtship, had not imagined that any man would want more from her than a clean room and hot meals. The idea that Dalton might actually care for her, might see past her worn dresses and work-roughened hands to something worth knowing, seemed almost impossible to believe. I do not know what to say, she admitted. Say you will at least consider the possibility, Dalton urged. I know I am just a cowboy without much to my name, and you are a successful businesswoman with your own establishment. But I am learning to be better, to think more carefully about the future, instead of just drifting from one day to the next. You have shown me that. Beatrice squeezed his hand, then gently pulled away. I need time to think, Dalton. This is unexpected, and I am not accustomed to making hasty decisions. Take all the time you need, Dalton said. I am not going anywhere. They walked back to town in a silence that was both comfortable and charged with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice's mind was racing, turning over everything that had been said and considering it from every angle. She had never expected to feel this way about anyone, had convinced herself that she was too practical, too focused on survival, to have room in her life for love. But something about Dalton made her want to reconsider, to open herself to the possibility that perhaps she could have more than just security and independence. That evening at supper, Beatrice was acutely aware of Dalton's presence at the table. Their eyes met several times during the meal, and each time she felt that strange flutter in her chest that was becoming increasingly familiar. After the dishes were cleared, Mr. Patterson asked if anyone wanted to join him for a walk down to the main street to hear the traveling preacher who was reportedly conducting an evening service. I think I will stay in tonight, Beatrice said, glancing at Dalton. I have some mending that needs attention. I will stay as well, Dalton said. Miss Jensen has been teaching me about making soap, and I would like to learn more if she has time. The other boarders departed, leaving Beatrice and Dalton alone in the kitchen. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and then Beatrice turned to the jar of saved cooking fat and the box of lye she kept carefully locked in a high cupboard. Soap making is dangerous if done improperly, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The lye can burn your skin badly, and you must be careful with the measurements or the soap will not set correctly. She walked Dalton through the process, showing him how to carefully mix the lye with water, how to heat the fat to the proper temperature, and how to combine them while stirring constantly until the mixture reached the right consistency. They worked side by side, shoulders occasionally brushing, and Beatrice found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact. You need to be patient, she instructed as Dalton stirred the mixture. Rushing will ruin it. You have to let the process happen in its own time. Patience is not my strongest virtue, Dalton admitted, but I am learning. When the soap mixture was poured into molds to set, they cleaned up together, falling into the easy rhythm they had established over the past week. Beatrice washed while Dalton dried, and the domestic comfort of the task felt more intimate than it should have. Beatrice, Dalton said quietly as they finished, have you thought any more about what I said today? She set down the dishcloth and turned to face him. I have thought of little else. And? Beatrice took a deep breath. I am afraid, she admitted. I have worked so hard to build this life, to create security for myself. I am afraid of risking that for something uncertain, something that might not last. Dalton set down the plate he had been drying and took a step closer. I cannot promise you certainty. Life on the frontier is too unpredictable for that, but I can promise you that I will work hard, that I will listen to your wisdom, and that I will do everything in my power to be worthy of your trust. He paused. I know I do not have much to offer right now, but I am learning from you how to build something lasting, how to save and plan for the future, instead of just drifting from one day to the next. That has to count for something. It does, Beatrice said softly. She studied his face, seeing the honesty there, the determination and the hope. I am not good at this, Dalton. I do not know how to be anything other than practical and careful. Romance seems like a luxury I cannot afford. Then do not think of it as romance, Eager, Dalton said, moving closer still. Think of it as a partnership. Two people who work well together, who share values and goals, who can build something better together than either could alone. A partnership, Beatrice echoed, considering the word. Put that way, it made sense. It was practical, logical, something she could justify to herself. That might be possible. Dalton reached out and gently cupped her cheek with his hand. May I kiss you, Beatrice? Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. Then she nodded just once, and Dalton leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was gentle, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might change her mind and pull away, but Beatrice did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her palms. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing hard. Dalton rested his forehead against hers, and Beatrice closed her eyes, allowing herself this moment of closeness, of connection with another human being in a way she had not experienced since her family was still alive. Stay in Deadwood, she whispered, not just for a few weeks. Stay. I will need to return to the ranch to settle my affairs and collect my wages, Dalton said. But yes, I will stay. I will find work here in town and save my money so that eventually I can buy that land I've been dreaming of. And if you will have me, I would like to court you properly, Beatrice Jensen. I would like that, Beatrice said, and smiled against his chest. I would like that very much. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and growing affection. Dalton returned to the rocking H to give his notice and collect his final pay, and when he came back to Deadwood 3 days later, Beatrice felt her heart leap at the sight of him riding down the main street. He had managed to secure a position at the livery stable, work that paid less than ranch hand wages but had the advantage of keeping him in town. More importantly, he had negotiated room and board as part of his compensation, which meant he could save nearly all his cash wages. "I have been thinking about what you said regarding waste at the ranch," Dalton told her that evening as they sat together in the boarding house kitchen. "I spoke to my former boss about some ways they could reduce losses. He actually listened, and he gave me a bonus when I left for making suggestions that might save them money." Beatrice felt a surge of pride. "That is wonderful, Dalton. What did you suggest?" Dalton pulled out a small notebook where he had written down his ideas: better organization of tools and equipment, a rotation system for food supplies to prevent spoilage, repairs to buildings before small problems became large, expensive ones, and more careful monitoring of cattle to catch illness early before it spread through the herd. "These are excellent ideas," Beatrice said, reading through his notes. "Practical and achievable. I am impressed." "I learned from the best," Dalton said, and the warmth in his eyes made her blush. As summer turned toward autumn, Beatrice and Dalton spent their evenings together, sometimes working on projects around the boarding house, sometimes simply talking about their hopes and plans for the future. Dalton proved to be an apt student of thrift, finding ways to stretch his wages further than he had ever imagined possible. He stopped drinking entirely, quit playing cards, and began putting aside money in a bank account with a determination that made Beatrice's heart swell with affection. "I calculated that if I save 75% of my wages, I can have enough for a down payment on land within 3 years," Dalton told her one evening in October as they walked through Deadwood streets. The air had turned crisp and the leaves on the scattered deciduous trees were turning gold and red. "5 years if I want enough to also build a proper house and barn. That is assuming land prices stay stable, and you have no unexpected expenses," Beatrice cautioned, though she was delighted by his planning. "You should build in a buffer for emergencies." "You're right," Dalton said, pulling out his notebook to make adjustments to his figures. "Maybe 70% saved, with the other 5% going to an emergency fund." They had reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land, and Dalton stopped, looking out over the valley. "I have been thinking about where I want to buy. There is a section of land about 10 miles from here, near a good water source. It is not much, maybe 160 acres, but it would be a start. Room for a small herd, space for a garden, and outbuildings." "It sounds lovely," Beatrice said, and realized she was imagining herself there with him. Could almost see the house they might build, the life they might create. Dalton turned to her, his expression serious. "Beatrice, we have been courting for 3 months now. I know that is not very long, but I'm 30 years old, and I know my own mind. I love you. I love your strength and your wisdom, your refusal to waste anything or give up on anything. I love the way you see possibility where others see nothing. I love how you have made me want to be better, to build something lasting." He took both her hands in his. "I would like to ask your permission to speak to you about marriage." Beatrice's breath caught. She had known this conversation was coming, had felt it building over the past weeks as their relationship deepened, but hearing the words still sent her heart racing. "You already have my permission to speak about it." "Then I am speaking," Dalton said, his voice steady despite the intensity in his eyes. "I want to marry you, Beatrice. I want to build that ranch with you. Create a life together where nothing is wasted and everything has value. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to learn from you and teach you what I know. To be partners in every sense of the word." He squeezed her hands. "I know I am still building my savings, that I cannot offer you luxury or ease, but I can offer you loyalty, hard work, and a future we build together. Is that enough?" Beatrice looked at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed it so completely. Dalton had not just learned thrift from her example, he had embraced it as a philosophy, a way of approaching life that matched her own values. More than that, he had shown her that her careful, cautious heart could still open to love, that she did not have to face the world alone. "Yes," she said, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, it is more than enough." I love you too, Dalton. I love your kindness and your determination, the way you listen when I speak and value what I have to say. I love that you see my careful ways not as miserly or strange, but as something worthwhile. I love how you make me feel less alone. She smiled through her tears. So yes, I will marry you. Dalton let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, and Beatrice kissed him back with all the passion she had been carefully keeping in check, allowing herself to feel the full force of her love for this man who had learned thrift from her example and given her back the courage to hope. They were married in November of 1877, in the same small church where they had first attended services together. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she purchased with money saved from her boarding house profits, and Dalton wore his best suit, carefully mended and pressed. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by Beatrice's boarders and several of Dalton's friends from the livery stable. After the wedding, Beatrice sold her boarding house to a widow from Denver who had been looking for a business opportunity in Deadwood. She got a fair price for it, and the money went into their joint savings, bringing their dream of owning land significantly closer to reality. They rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town while they continued to save and plan. Dalton kept his job at the livery stable, and Beatrice took in sewing and mending, carefully building their nest egg dollar by dollar. Every evening they sat together and reviewed their accounts, planning and calculating, making sure every penny was accounted for and put to its best use. "We are close," Dalton said one evening in the spring of 1878, studying their bank book. "Another 6 months and we will have enough for the down payment on that land I showed you?" Beatrice leaned against his shoulder, feeling a contentment she had never imagined possible. "We should start planning the house. If we design it carefully, we can build it in stages as money allows, starting with something basic and adding on over time." "Of course you would already be thinking 3 steps ahead," Dalton said fondly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That is one of the many reasons I love you." In September of 1878, they purchased 160 acres of land 10 miles from Deadwood, near a reliable creek that would provide water for livestock and irrigation. The land was rough and undeveloped, covered in prairie grass and scattered with rocky outcroppings, but to Beatrice and Dalton it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was theirs, bought with money they had saved through careful planning and absolute refusal to waste a single cent on anything unnecessary. They lived in a tent on their new property while they built a small cabin, working together to fell trees, mill lumber, and construct a one-room house that would serve as their home until they could afford to expand. Beatrice designed the cabin with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that every square foot of space served multiple purposes. The walls had built-in storage, the loft served as both sleeping area and additional storage, and the fireplace was positioned to heat the entire space efficiently. During their first winter on the land, they survived on food they had preserved and stored, supplemented by game Dalton hunted. Beatrice used every part of every animal, wasting nothing. The meat was eaten or preserved, the bones made into broth or tools, the hides tanned into leather, the fat rendered for cooking and candles. When spring came, they planted a large garden, amending the soil with compost they had been building all winter from kitchen scraps and animal waste. "I've been offered a job breaking horses for the army fort," Dalton told Beatrice one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over their land. "It pays well, but it would mean being away for several weeks at a time." Beatrice considered this carefully. "How much does it pay?" Dalton named a figure that made her eyes widen. "That is excellent wages. With that money, we could buy breeding stock much sooner than planned." "But I do not like the idea of leaving you alone here," Dalton said, taking her hand. "It is isolated and there are dangers. Wild animals, bad weather, the possibility of trouble from drifters or hostile parties." "I am not helpless," Beatrice said firmly. "I can handle a rifle, and I'm perfectly capable of managing the property for a few weeks. If the money is that good, we should consider it seriously." They discussed the opportunity from every angle, weighing the risks against the benefits, and eventually decided that Dalton would take the job. The money was too good to pass up, and it would significantly accelerate their plans for building up the ranch. While Dalton was away, Beatrice proved her competence and resilience. She maintained the property, cared for the small flock of chickens and 2 goats they had acquired, and continued work on the garden. She also began processing cattails from the creek into a variety of useful products. The fluffy seed heads for pillow stuffing, the leaves for weaving into mats and baskets, the roots for food. Nothing was wasted. Everything had value. When Dalton returned after 6 weeks away, he found the property in perfect order, and Beatrice waiting for him with a smile and a collection of beautiful woven baskets she had made to sell in Deadwood. "I missed you every single day," he said, holding her close. "But I'm so impressed by everything you have accomplished while I was gone." "I missed you too," Beatrice said, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "But I knew you were working hard for our future, and that made the separation bearable." With the money Dalton earned from his horse-breaking job, they were able to purchase 10 head of cattle, carefully selected for breeding potential. Beatrice studied cattle management with the same intensity she applied to everything else, learning about bloodlines and genetics, nutrition and disease prevention. Under her meticulous care and planning, their small herd thrived. In the spring of 1879, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a certain amount of trepidation. A baby would stretch their resources and require adjustments to their careful plans. "We will manage," Dalton assured her, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "We have built a good foundation. We can afford this." Beatrice leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to feel the full weight of happiness. "I am going to make sure this child learns the value of things just as my mother taught me. No waste, no carelessness. Everything has purpose and meaning." "Of course you will," Dalton said fondly. "Our child will be the most thrifty youngster in the Dakota Territory." Their son was born in December of 1879, during a fierce winter storm that buried their cabin in snow. The birth was difficult, assisted only by Dalton since they could not reach Deadwood for a doctor, but mother and baby both survived. They named him Thomas, after Beatrice's lost brother, and Daniel, after Dalton's father. Thomas Daniel Nash was a healthy, robust baby who quickly became the center of his parents' world. Beatrice made his clothes from fabric she had woven herself from wool traded with a neighboring rancher, and his toys were carved by Dalton from scrap wood. Nothing the baby needed was purchased new if it could be made from materials they already possessed. As Thomas grew, he absorbed his parents' values as naturally as breathing. By the time he was 5, he could already identify edible plants, help in the garden, and understood that nothing was to be wasted. He followed his mother around, learning to preserve food, mend clothes, and find uses for items other children might have discarded. "That boy is going to be running his own ranch by the time he is 20, Dalton observed proudly one evening, watching Thomas carefully collect eggs from the chicken coop, making sure not to break a single one. "Sooner if he keeps learning at this rate," Beatrice agreed, smiling as their son brought the eggs to her with solemn concentration. The ranch grew slowly but steadily over the years. Every decision was carefully considered, every purchase planned and budgeted. They expanded their cabin, adding 2 additional rooms as their family grew. A daughter, Miriam Louise, was born in 1882, followed by another son, James Robert, in 1885. Each child was raised with the same values their parents held dear. Nothing wasted, everything valued. Careful planning and hard work as the keys to success. By 1890, the Nash Ranch had grown to 400 acres and boasted a herd of over 200 cattle. They had built a proper barn, a chicken coop that could house 50 birds, and a root cellar that kept vegetables fresh through the winter. Dalton had earned a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in the territory, and Beatrice was known throughout the region for her ability to make anything from scratch and waste nothing in the process. Other ranchers came to them for advice, marveling at how the Nashes had built such a successful operation from nothing. Beatrice and Dalton always gave the same answer: careful planning, hard work, and absolute refusal to waste anything. "Every penny saved is a penny that can be put to better use," Beatrice would say. "Every scrap preserved is food for tomorrow. Every item maintained is a future expense avoided. It is not complicated. It simply requires attention and care." Their children grew up strong and capable, each one learning the lessons their parents taught. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch work as he grew older, showing the same careful management and thrift his parents exemplified. Miriam became an expert gardener and preserver, able to put up enough vegetables and fruit to last the family through even the harshest winter. James showed a talent for mechanics and repair, able to fix anything that broke and keep equipment running long past its expected lifespan. In 1895, when Thomas was 16, Dalton sat down with his oldest son to discuss the future. "Your mother and I have been thinking. This ranch is large enough to support multiple families now. When you are ready to marry and start your own family, we will deed you 80 acres on the north section. You can build your own place there, raise your own herd. The land is yours, but you have to promise to maintain the values we have taught you." Thomas looked at his father with shining eyes. "I promise, Pa. Everything has value. Nothing gets wasted. I will teach my children the same way you and Ma taught me." Beatrice, listening from the kitchen, felt tears prick her eyes. This was what they had worked for, what all the sacrifice and careful planning had been building toward, a legacy that would continue beyond their own lives, children who understood the importance of thrift and would pass it on to their own children in turn. That evening, as Beatrice and Dalton sat together on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over land they had transformed through years of careful work, Dalton took his wife's hand. "Do you remember that first day we met?" he asked, "when you were collecting vegetable peels behind the boarding house?" "I remember," Beatrice said, smiling at the memory. "I remember thinking you were probably going to mock me for it." "Instead, I fell in love," Dalton said. "Not all at once, but piece by piece, watching you turn nothing into something, waste into value, struggle into success. You taught me what it means to truly respect the resources we have, to honor the work and effort that goes into creating everything we use." "You were an excellent student," Beatrice said, squeezing his hand. "You took what I taught you and made it your own. You showed me that thrift is not just about saving money or avoiding waste, but about building something lasting, something that matters." "We built it together," Dalton said, "and we will keep building it together for as long as we have." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The ranch spread out before them, every building and fence and cultivated field a testament to their shared values and unwavering commitment to each other, and to the principle that nothing should ever be wasted. In 1898, Thomas married a young woman named Sarah Fletcher, who shared the Nash family's values and fit seamlessly into their way of life. True to their word, Beatrice and Dalton deeded him 80 acres and helped him build a small cabin to start his married life. Within 2 years, Thomas and Sarah welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Beatrice after her grandmother. Holding her tiny granddaughter for the first time, Beatrice felt a profound sense of completion. She had survived loss and hardship, had built a life from nothing through determination and careful planning, and had found love with a man who understood and shared her deepest values. Together they had created not just a successful ranch, but a family legacy that would continue for generations. "What are you thinking about, Renoise?" Dalton asked, coming to stand beside her as she rocked the baby. "I am thinking about how everything comes full circle," Beatrice said softly. "How nothing is ever truly wasted if you use it properly. All those years of saving scraps and counting pennies, all the work and planning and sacrifice, it all led to this. To a family that understands the value of things, to children and grandchildren who will carry these lessons forward." "It is a good legacy," Dalton agreed, placing his hand on her shoulder. "The best legacy we could leave." As the new century dawned, the Nash Ranch continued to thrive. Miriam married in 1902, wedding a farmer's son who quickly learned the Nash way of doing things under Beatrice's patient instruction. James showed no interest in marrying. content instead to focus on the ranch and his mechanical innovations, which helped the family farm more efficiently and with less waste of effort and resources. Dalton and Beatrice grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but their minds remained sharp, and their commitment to each other and their principles never wavered. They still reviewed the ranch accounts together every evening, still planned and calculated and looked for ways to eliminate waste and increase efficiency. "We should write down everything we know," Beatrice said one evening in 1905, when she was 50 and Dalton was 58. "All the techniques and methods we have developed over the years. It should be preserved for our grandchildren and their children after them." So they began the painstaking work of documenting their knowledge, filling notebook after notebook with detailed instructions on everything from soap making to cattle breeding, from garden planning to equipment maintenance. It became their retirement project, a way of ensuring that their hard-won wisdom would not be lost. In 1910, Dalton's health began to decline. His heart was weakening, the doctor said, worn out from years of hard work. Beatrice nursed him with the same careful attention she gave to everything else in her life, rationing his energy, planning his diet, ensuring he got proper rest. She squeezed 3 more good years from his failing heart through sheer determination and meticulous care. Dalton Nash died peacefully in his sleep on a warm July night in 1913, with Beatrice holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words were about the ranch, final instructions on the management of the property he and Beatrice had built from nothing. After he was gone, Beatrice grieved deeply, but without falling apart. She had learned long ago that waste included wasting time on despair when there was work to be done. She continued managing her portion of the ranch with Thomas's help, continued teaching her grandchildren the principles she and Dalton had lived by, continued documenting their accumulated knowledge. Grandma, her granddaughter, young Beatrice, now 12 years old, asked one day as they worked together in the garden, "Why is it so important not to waste things?" Beatrice straightened slowly, her back protesting the movement, and looked at the child who bore her name. "Because everything has value, sweet girl. Everything represents someone's work, someone's time, someone's resources. When we waste things, we dishonor the effort that went into creating them. But more than that, we limit ourselves. Every scrap we save, every item we maintain, every resource we use, wisely gives us more freedom, more security, more ability to build the life we want instead of just surviving the life we have." "Like you and Grandpa did," young Beatrice said. "Papa says you started with nothing and built all of this." "We did," Beatrice confirmed. "And we did it by refusing to waste anything, by finding value in what others overlooked, and by working together toward a shared goal. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew, and one of the things that made him so fine was his willingness to learn, to change his habits and embrace new ways of thinking. He learned thrift from my example, but he made it his own, and then taught it back to me in new ways. That is what partnership means." Young Beatrice nodded solemnly, absorbing this lesson along with all the others her grandmother had taught her. Beatrice Jensen Nash lived to the age of 73, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1928. By that time, the ranch had grown to over 800 acres and was operated by her children and grandchildren, all of whom carried on the principles she and Dalton had established. The notebooks she and Dalton had filled with their accumulated knowledge became treasured family heirlooms, passed down through generations as practical guides and reminders of the values that built the Nash family fortune. On Beatrice's headstone, placed next to Dalton's in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, her children had engraved a simple epitaph: "She wasted nothing and valued everything. She taught us to do the same." The Nash Ranch continued to operate successfully through the Great Depression, through wars and droughts and all the challenges that faced American agriculture in the 20th century. While other ranches failed, the Nashes survived and even thrived, guided by the principles Beatrice had lived by and Dalton had learned from her example: careful planning, meticulous maintenance, absolute refusal to waste anything, and the understanding that every resource has multiple uses if you are creative enough to find them. The story of Beatrice and Dalton became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. How she had started with nothing but determination and skill, how he had been a drifting cowboy until he learned thrift from her example, how together they had built not just a ranch but a legacy of values that sustained their family for generations. Their great-great-grandchildren still operated portions of the original ranch in the early 21st century, and many of them carried on the traditions their ancestors had established. They still made soap from cooking fat, still preserved food for winter, still maintained equipment rather than replacing it, still planned carefully and refused to waste anything. The world had changed enormously since 1877, but the principles Beatrice and Dalton had lived by remained as valid and valuable as ever. In the end, their love story was not just about romance, though they had loved each other deeply. It was about partnership, about two people who found in each other the perfect complement to their own strengths and values. It was about how learning can be an act of love, how changing yourself to embrace another person's wisdom is not weakness, but strength. Most of all, it was about the enduring truth that nothing is ever truly wasted if you can find the value in it, whether that something is a potato peel, a scrap of fabric, a day's labor, or a human heart. Beatrice had been the woman who never wasted a single thing, and Dalton had been the cowboy who learned thrift from her example. Together, they had proven that the most valuable things in life are not the ones you buy, but the ones you build, that the richest legacy is not money, but wisdom, and that the greatest love is not the one that comes easily, but the one that grows through shared work, shared values, and shared commitment to building something that will last long after you are gone. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and the passage of time. But what they built together, what they taught their children and their children's children, continued on, a living testament to the power of thrift, hard work, careful planning, and the kind of love that transforms not just two individual lives, but generations yet to come. In that sense, Beatrice and Dalton never truly wasted anything, not even a single moment of the life they built together from nothing but determination, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the principles they both held dear.